Let's do a code review for our button press LED circuit. So at the beginning, we first import the GPIO library. We have seen that before, which allows us to programmatically interact with the GPIO pins. Then we import the time library, which allows us to sleep and have pauses in our program. We do GPIO.set warnings false, and of course that just suppresses any outputs to the shell that we don't necessarily care about. Then we set the LED pin to be equal to 11 since it's connected to that 11 physical pin on the Raspberry Pi, and our button pin equal to 16. Again, that was connected to pin 16 on the Raspberry Pi. For the mode, we do GPIO.setMode, GPIO.board since we are referencing the pins by their physical location. And then we set up our LED pin as an output by doing the GPIO.setup, calling that function, passing in the LED pin and the GPIO.out, and initially we turn our LED off. So GPIO.output to our LED pin, and we set that GPIO.low. That would turn our LED off initially because our button obviously isn't being pressed. Next, we enable the pull-up resistor on our button pin, and we have discussed this before and how it works and why an external resistor connected to our button is not necessary, and we can just leverage the internal pull-up resistors that are provided to us on the Raspberry Pi. So that's what we're doing in this line of code. Next, we get to the meat of our program, the while true loop, again, which this loops indefinitely as long as our program is executed. Here we're going to take a different approach. I wanted to introduce a different trick instead of simply polling. So GPIO affords us a wait for edge function, and essentially what this does is it halts the execution of the program and it waits for the particular pin, our button pin, to fall. And remember, when our button is pressed, the value of that button pin goes from high to low or true to false, and that would be a falling edge which is detected. And once that's the case, we print the button pressed down to the shell and we turn our LED on. So we do a GPIO.output telling our LED to go high, and we pass in that GPIO.high argument. Then we call the wait for edge function for it to rise again. So passing in the button pin argument, and of course the condition is GPIO.rising, and what that means is, again, our program waits around for that value to go from low to high or from false to true. And of course, if that happens, that means that we have released our finger from the button. And once that's the case, we set our LED pin to low and turn it off. So I just wanted to introduce a different mechanism for determining when our button is pressed. And of course, when we determine that that is in fact the case, we would light our LED or turn it off respectively instead of polling. So here, this is a different trick for determining when an event happens on our pin, and it can be used in any of your Raspberry Pi projects. So just wanted to provide you a different tip and trick and alternative for working with event detection. Let's quickly take a look at the documentation for this wait for edge function. So if we open up a Chromium tab and go to Google, and we can do a search for GPIO, wait for edge. And once that comes up, this first link, the SourceForge link, you can go ahead and click on it. And this is the documentation for the GPIO, specifically the inputs on the GPIO library. And here, if we scroll down, there's a section that discusses interrupts and edge detection, and here's the wait for edge function. So from the documentation, you can see here the wait for edge Python function takes the channel that it's waiting on, and this was the button pin, and also depending on if you're waiting for a rising edge, a falling edge, or perhaps both, that's the second argument you pass in. So this function is designed to block execution of your program until an edge is detected. Again, just another way to poll instead of having a constantly checking the state of the button. This is just a quick way to have the GPIO library itself wait for an event to happen, and then you can react to it accordingly. So I just wanted to show how you could have checked the Python documentation for the GPIO library and what that wait for edge function does.